politically, surely, if you had your brain screwed on, you think, actually, this could come out. This might not look great. Somebody who's aspiring to be a prime minister, maybe we should change that.
Hello and welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. My name is John Potter. I am the leader of the Preston Lib Dems and I host this fantastic podcast made for and delivered to activists in the Lib Dem party. And with us we have two brilliant luminaries and part of our regular panelists. We have David McKenzie. How are you doing, David?
Yeah, I'm good, John. Thank you.
And we have the wonderful, the brilliant, and now officially selected for Mid Sussex, Alison Bennett. How are you doing, Alison?
I'm very well, John. How are you?
Very well, and congratulations on your selection. Was that fun?
It was fun. Yeah, it was good. Good conversations, interesting hustings, and really delighted to have been selected.
And I suppose before we get into the meat of the thing, we could just ask you, Alison, what was it like at the hustings in terms of people getting ready? Because the general election, not far away.
Yeah, I mean, big question everybody wants to know is when's the general election going to be? Nobody seems to know. I believe it has to be by the 28th of January, 2025. Yeah, that's
right. It got moved. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. My assumption, I think the best working assumption you can make is sometime in 2023 and be ready.
Do you think? Well, I think you've got to prepare for 23, but I reckon it's 24 now. I think the Tories will push it to as far as possible now, I think. But we'll see. They'll just do it whenever they can because fixed term parliament's over. So they'll just, as soon as it's advantageous, they'll go for it. But we also better just say to everyone who's watching and listening, firstly, thank you very much for people who comment. You can follow everything to do with the Lib Dem podcast at Lib Dem Pod. We are in the middle of the May local election campaigns for those that have them, and we have huge ones in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, London, and wonderful places like Preston. But we should also congratulate, because unbelievably, two Lib Dems have already been elected. They were elected unopposed in Wales. So on one side, fantastic for you. That's absolutely brilliant news. On the other side, I would probably think, I've just spent £1,000 on leaflets that I don't need to get out. So there's always good and bad things to it. But we're going to talk a little bit first about what it feels like on the ground, on the people that were on the doorstep. So, David, I mean, not just on the doorstep, but generally, how do you think the mood of the country is towards the Tories?
Well, I think, there tends to be this assumption because obviously a lot of focus is currently on events that are happening in Ukraine, that a lot of the anger that was felt towards the Conservatives, especially over the Downing Street Party scandal, as well as things like the national insurance rise, has kind of been pushed to the background. I actually think a lot of people are still very angry about this. It's still front and center of their minds. I think people are seeing the cost of living crisis. They're seeing, the cost of energy rise. Things like petrol obviously are increasing on a massive basis. People are going to start asking questions about this government. And I think they know that the local elections presents a good opportunity for them to give them, for lack of a better term, a kicking. So I think we're going to see some serious gains for the Liberal Democrats in this election. I think Labour as well will probably benefit quite highly from, current events with this government. And I think Boris is in for a bit of a shock. And I'd also say Rishi Sunak has to bear some of the responsibility for that also.
So, I mean, someone had made a comment on an interview Alison and I was listening to the other week where they think the Partygate issue had given, and the Ukrainian war had given Boris a stay of execution rather than actually got him off the hook. And I get that kind of backs up what David was saying there, that people are still angry, and actually that hasn't really gone away, even though what's happening in Ukraine has taken the fore in the news front.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I believe that normally you see a bit of a bounce in the polls at times of national crisis and war, and that's not really happened for Boris. And I think that's because people know that he's done wrong and he's going to have to go at some point. People are really angry about that. We've got two by-elections on in West Sussex today, one in a place called Storrington, which is kind of rural and pretty affluent, another one in Burgess Hill, which is a town near me. And long-standing Conservative voters that I've spoken to in both those wards are really questioning where their support lies, really not convinced that they want to vote for the Conservatives. So we'll have to see how those results play out.
And from my point of view, I mean, when we did the episode last week, where I hadn't really kind of got into full-on campaign mode yet. I was still doing nomination papers, and congratulations to everyone who got the nominations in. Well done. Even if you are in, you get 30 votes. It's still giving people a chance to vote Lib Dem. But in the last week, I have proper gunned the doors in various areas. And the shift from what I'm seeing is quite interesting. So we had people who were long-term Tories, because we do a lot of canvassing here in Preston, that were very, very soft now in terms of, I would guess maybe if they were going to vote, they might switch, but actually my guess is they probably wouldn't vote at all. But what was interesting is, because we got a bit of a kicking last year, and we can track where these people are going. And so these were kind of Lib Dem people who would probably vote Tory nationally in a general election, but went fully Tory last year for the locals, and this year fully back with us. And so I think it'll be interesting to see what the results will be. I think the Tories are in for a bad night if this is reflected. And one of the key things that we've got, I mean, we're now very actively asking people if they want to put a poster up. You know, if they said, you know, I always vote Lib Dem, we've got myself and our canvassing teams are saying now, would you mind putting a poster up more often than not? But we have given out about 36 posters to people, and these aren't our deliverers or our regulars. These are just kind of ordinary punters on the door. So there is definitely a kind of shift there, and it'll be really interesting to see if that holds up for the rest of the term. Because I don't think things are going to get better for the Tories. Do you think so, Alison? Do you think? I mean, in a sense, I think only things can get worse.
Absolutely. I was reading this morning that the real impact of the cost of living crisis hasn't even begun yet. And people are already noticing, you know, how much it costs to fill up your car. Obviously, fuel rises have come in, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. And it's going to get really, really tough, and from a really tough place that we're starting in already.
And and we should say it's not just, obviously, I mean, there's lots of stuff with cost of living to do with individuals and families, which is very scary, but the effect on businesses as well. And a very iconic one here in Preston is there's a fish and chip shop not a million miles away from me that's been going for decades and decades, and it was very well known because it was 24 hours. It was the thing, and they've had to shut. They just said, look, we can't do it anymore. You know, the cost in our energy just means it's just not sustainable, and so they've closed completely, and that's terrifying, David, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's something that people are now starting to get more aware of. Like you, John, locally where I live, you know, I live in a village. It's not a big community, and we're regularly visited by sort of, you know, pop-up eateries and stuff like that come to the local pub's car park. And one of them recently said, look, we have to be upfront with our regular customers. Our prices are going to have to go up. Yeah. And that's as a result of not only the energy impact and things like there, when they're running the stall, obviously they have to have gas there to run the burners. But they said it's also the fact of the import costs of bringing the produce that they do to make it's a Greek pop-up. To do that is going up also. So I think people are going to see it across the board. It's not only going to affect businesses, it's also going to affect individuals. But the other thing I think that's important to note that I've actually seen coming into a lot of people's thinking in these local elections are people are really starting to question, are the Conservatives actually the best people to run and look after local government? Because people are starting to notice that over the preceding 12 years or so when the Conservatives have been in government, that increasingly funding has been slashed to local government. They're having to make difficult choices over local services and how they provide those and provision those. But also people are now starting to see that things that are being pushed onto local government, like for instance, when I was talking to councillors in Wokingham about the impact of social care and the burden that will put on councils, it will effectively potentially bankrupt local councils. And I think it's important to note that I think the first council to go bankrupt in the country was Conservative run. So obviously starts to question it. Yeah. And
there's very little hiding place. When we have in one of our big contest between the Tories and us locally, the Tories have put out a leaflet, and we had a chuckle about. I don't know if I shared it on the podcast WhatsApp, but basically she said we are not going to be canvassing this time, which they said because of concerns about COVID. When actually the translation is they can't find people to do it, and said unlike the other parties, as in us, we are not going to just attack them for what they're doing. And it's kind of like, do you know how bad your county council is? Do you know things like so? That I think they're getting a lot of pressure, and because the Tories did well in the counties last year, There's no way behind it. The counties are the big authorities outside of the Mets, and the Tories are more or less in control of most of them. They're whacking up council tax. The roads are still rubbish. Social care isn't being fixed, despite what the government may say they've done. And so there's a lot of pressure on these Tory councils. And it's important to know, because some people aren't quite sure, but the Tories have more councillors than anyone else in the country still. I think they top over 7,000 councillors. So there's an awful lot of Tories that will be worried. And, Alison, I suppose, I've always had the opinion, if these elections go south for the Tories, that will end Boris Johnson. It will be that. And that's why it's so important that Lib Dems get their candidates and just give people a chance to give the Tories a kicking, really.
Yeah, definitely. At the height of Partygates of January time, I believe one of the theories about why the 54 letters didn't go into the 1922 committee was that the membership of the Conservative associations across the country was still fundamentally supportive of Boris Johnson. And the MPs didn't want to go against their Conservative associations. And so something they wanted to do was wait for the local election results, where potentially the Conservatives are going to get a bit of a kicking. And then that will turn the local membership against the PM. And then the MPs feel safe to put in their letters of no confidence. So we'll have to see if that plays out or not.
And there was a split in reports of it actually saying that the MPs that didn't have elections in their areas this year were like kind of, no, Boris is fine, let's just ride this out, it's okay. MPs that have councillors that might lose their seats this year were the more likely to put in letters or speak publicly about what a disgrace Boris is. Hello, John from the Lib Dem Podcast here. We are delighted to say that this episode is sponsored by Pray to Reigns. Now more than ever, you need a professional-looking online presence and website. Pray to Reigns have been helping Liberal Democrat campaigns succeed for 18 years. Their Lib Dem Foci package combines a website, social media and email system to help Lib Dems win. You'll receive great support from real people, fair pricing and a huge range of features to choose from. Pray to Reigns are already the bespoke developers for Lighthouse, Lib Dem Draw Online and the LD Directory. They combine a talented system design with an unrivaled understanding of our party, our data and our systems. To find out more, check out the Pray to Reigns website at praytoreigns.co.uk/liberal-democrats. Speaking of things going slightly wrong, I think that leads us perfectly to Rishi Sunak and actually just how badly the spring statement has gone. We had an episode last week where we touched about how we were underwhelmed. It didn't seem to do an awful lot, and actually we've seen in the past week an absolute plummet in his popularity. And also, I think there's quite a lot of briefing going from within Tory HQ against Sunak. And I realise that listeners won't do this, but if you hold up the latest cover of Private Eye, which is all about Rishi Sunak, which is absolutely brilliant. I recommend you go and see it, including the "keep my wife's name out of your effing mouth" quote, which is even more topical because just this morning, the revelations from The Independent about Rishi Sunak's wife as having a non-dom status and not paying tax, even though she might have legally done nothing wrong. If you're in that position where you are asking people to tighten their belts, to say the government can't do everything, to have a family member that's avoided potentially millions of pounds worth of tax, let's just say it's not a great look, is it, David?
No, I mean, look, let's be frank here. Even, as you say, she might not have legally done anything wrong. You're claiming non-dom status, and for anybody who might be listening that doesn't know what that means, it basically means you claim to be non-primary domiciled in the UK, so you don't have to pay tax on foreign investments and foreign income to the UK tax authorities. Now, Rishi Sunak's wife, for anybody who doesn't know, is a major, or her family, including her, are major investors in, I think it's Infosys in India.
She's a fashion designer, is what her thing is. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But obviously, she's domiciled in Downing Street. She lives with the Chancellor in Downing Street. It's her primary residence, and she's claiming non-dom status. I mean, for anybody to think that there would not be moral outrage at that, from when people are being asked to really shore up, there's a cost of living crisis, and just get on with it and deal with it as best as you possibly can. It really shows again this Tory mentality of them and us. We're above this, and it's not anything. What we're asking you to do is not what we should be asking ourselves to do. The other thing that I think is key to know is Rishi Sunak, when he really got appointed Chancellor, was, to be frank, a bit of an unknown. And he was brought in to obviously replace the existing Chancellor, and I think it was sort of seen as he's somebody that will kind of take orders from number 10 and do as they asked. I think what we're finding now is that the clean, image that he got when he came in, there's now things that are in the closet that are coming out about things he's been involved with, and I just think it was laughable for him to go on the radio and say that he can understand Will Smith's reaction because he feels the same about how people talk about his wife. I mean, talk about completely missing the mark on how people were reacting to that story. It's just unbelievable.
Alison?
Yeah, and it also speaks to his political nous, don't you think?
Yeah.
That regardless of, I think it's legal, the choices they've made about her non-dom status might be legal. It might be morally questionable, but if you're going to be, a top politician, Chancellor of the Exchequer, living at number 11, politically, surely, if you had your brain screwed on, you think, actually, this could come out. This might not look great. Somebody who's aspiring to be a prime minister, maybe we should change that.
Yeah.
Maybe the money was more important to them. And don't forget that this is also the week that it's come out that Sunak's made £100,000 donation to Winchester, his old public school.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of dubious political decisions being made here in Team Rishi.
I mean, non-dom status came out. I mean, it was a big issue. I think in like 2015 or something, or one of the big elections. And actually, it just shows you she may have been completely legal, but actually the law should be changed. Let's just accept that there's so much tax on earned wealth instead of unearned wealth in this country that actually a shift in the tax system is absolutely needed. And non-doms became the focus of that. And it was also with mansion taxes that we had put forward and other such things. But it just kind of highlights the stupidity of, and he declared it as well. Let's be honest with it. He has put it on parliamentary declaration of interest forms and stuff like that. But again, it just smacks of being politically naive from his point of view. And this is now a running pattern with Sunak in terms of everyone thought he was being a little bit politically naive and lightweight when Partygate happened. He had an opportunity there, didn't take it. So it'll be interesting to see. But certainly the shine has come off him. And like I say, his poll ratings now have absolutely plummeted. And where he goes from here is interesting. But then we've also then got other things, say, because the national insurance rise has just occurred. So the swing statement isn't doing anything to protect that. Mm-hmm. And so he's going to have to come back again. So we'll talk about the general election at the start of the show. It's almost like it's again this pattern of the Tory government of not doing something until it's a crisis. And it's actually just, they never seem to get out in front of things and fix it. It's always like, wait for the next crisis and then we'll do it. But the problem is, though, it means it keeps it in the story. So like Partygate, they could have ended. If they had just done it, come up front at the start, people would have been outraged, but then suddenly it'd have passed, the news would have passed. But now, because it's dragged on for months, it's got worse. And I just think they're doing the same thing with cost of living, David.
Yeah, but isn't that sort of a typical Boris Johnson type? That's how he exists in politics. It is, swaying from crisis to crisis and never apologising or admitting to anything and just hoping that it'll all die down and he'll be able to survive it in some way. And also, let's be honest, Boris has thrown other people under the bus to save his own skin, and he will continue to do that. And
he's thrown Northern Ireland under the bus to save his own skin.
Yeah. So that will continue to happen. We talked about this with Alison saying, when we're expecting the next general election. I think as it stands now, he will literally wait until the last moment to do that, and he'll wait until polls are obviously favourable, as you would assume anyone would do. But yeah, I think at this moment in time, he's going to have to wait a long time before he gets in a position where he can call another general election. And, I don't think this will be the last crisis we'll sway to. And I think there's things that will be uncovered as well about how this government's been running that will, again, question Boris Johnson's leadership.
I want to do just a little bit about Sunak's wealth, because this is something I thought that some, particularly Labour, get wrong. that I've seen many Labour people going, oh, look, he's got a £400 coffee mug or whatever it is, or he has a very expensive Peloton bike. I don't think that works, that kind of politics of envy sort of stuff. That idea that, because if someone says, oh, he's got a really funky coffee mug that keeps it at a constant temperature, whatever, some people will go, that's quite cool, or whatever. It's not something that immediately, it's the hypocrisy stuff that gets you, or feeling like you're out of touch. And I think that's where Sunak has now gone wrong. This whole, he got on a massive bandwagon with furlough, gave him loads of things because they thought, all right, he's there, he's helped people. That has now completely changed, where people, like the petrol price thing, I don't know why they thought that was such a good idea, because everyone's saying, it saves what, £3 off the average price of filling up your car, which is obviously welcome, but there are far better uses of that money to be able to help people through what they're going through, Alison.
Yeah, I mean, don't you think the thing with him is that he came in as Chancellor just before the pandemic started? So he'd been in the job about 4 weeks, and he had to put in place a number of policies that I don't think anybody expected to see probably any government do, but certainly a Conservative one, to do with furlough, things that were very generous. And I think his natural instinct is to be a tax-cutting Chancellor, a classic Conservative, and he needs within his own party to establish that reputation. So that's why you've got the income tax cut proposed for 2024. But the reality is that people can't afford to feed their families, can't afford to eat their homes, can't afford to fill their cars up with petrol. And there's a very real problem with funding of major public services like the NHS. So he's having to put up taxes and break manifesto promises, and we should keep reminding people about that. And while he's doing that, that's going against the grain of probably instinctively what he needs to do. And even the tax rises that are going in, they're both hurting people and they're not going to fix the problem of being enough to fund the NHS properly, let alone social care. So he's in a tough bind, without wanting to feel sorry for him, I don't. And let's bear in mind that the cost of living crisis isn't something that any chancellor, I believe, can wave a magic wand and fix. But he's not taking the steps needed for the people on benefits in the spring statement, and those that are most vulnerable and are going to be struggling and in a really tough place in the months ahead.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the answer when you try and regarding cost of living is there's always more you could do, but what they are doing is not doing much, I think is kind of where we're at. But I want to ask you an actual question here. So we're talking about manifesto pledges and broken promises, and the national insurance one's a classic one. Do you think the population will care those manifesto commitments have been broken? Because in my view, I think the public will probably say, well, what we've gone through in 2 years has been unprecedented. So I don't know if that's going to have such a big impact as it normally would. What's your view, David?
I think in some ways you are right, John. I think there's a lot of people who would be willing to say, well, this was unforeseen. And obviously that means you have to have a complete, sort of U-turn on a lot of things to deal with a crisis. So I think there will be people who will give the sort of benefit of the doubt. But I think there'll also be people that will go, well, hold on a minute. There's a lot of things that were promised in terms of, I think the main thing is obviously the opportunities and that would come with Brexit that just haven't, come to fruition. And we've now got Jacob Rees-Mogg leading that up, and so far I don't think he's found anything. But I think there will be people who will give the benefit of the doubt, but I don't think you just let them get off with it, because I think there's a lot of things they've U-turned on that they didn't have to, and in fact could have done a lot more on. Which we should really be highlighting to the voters. But again, it also leads the question of, do people read manifestos out of the likes of ourselves? Probably not. They take the headlines. So it depends on what issues you're targeting them on, if they really took notice of it at the time.
And Alison, same question to you. I mean, you're going to be at a hustings at some point with your rivals, and do you think you'd go hard on the fact that they've broken manifesto promises on tax, etc.?
Possibly. I mean, I think currently what I think I'd go hard on is the sitting Conservative MP is Mims Davies, who's a work and pensions minister, and her big project's been Kickstart. about a month ago, the Public Accounts Committee at Parliament produced a report about Kickstart and just revealed gross mismanagement, no management information to oversee where the money was going, making sure that actually it was achieving its stated aim of tackling youth unemployment driven by the pandemic. And if anything, they think it's widened inequality between different groups amongst young people. So, yeah, they might have broken their promise on national insurance and tax rises, but actually, even on the things they have had to do in response to the pandemic, there's been terrible mismanagement and a huge waste of money. And voters hate to see that, I think.
For those listeners who don't know what Kickstart was, basically this was a government plan for 16 to 24-year-olds to get 6 months of paid salary to go into various workplaces, almost like a kind of a startup apprenticeship, and then hopefully the employers will take them on. Is what
with a £1.9 billion budget.
Yeah, so but
big money.
But the actual the success of it has been dismal. But let's think about other things that have been dismal. And one of it has just come out kind of last night, which was their energy strategy. And so obviously brought really into the fore with everything that's going on in Ukraine, gas and oil prices, the whole shebang, and actually how slow Britain has been in getting an energy strategy sorted. Now, the headlines for listeners and viewers are that there's going to be a huge push on nuclear. They are going up from a stated wanting to be 12% of our national power by 2050 being nuclear up to 25%. Now, some people say, is that even doable given the government's track record on big projects? We will see. Again, offshore wind, they want to improve offshore wind. However, onshore wind, there are very much I think the NIMBY caucus in the Tory ranks has kind of made sure that didn't get too high up. And then obviously there's been lots of rumours about fracking, whether that should come back again. Huge topic here in Lancashire, where Quadrillo, obviously, the well was being sealed because of those test results. And we should just point out that it was Ed Davies' kind of limits on what vibrations could and tremors could come from fracking that were breached, and so actually put a stop to it. Now, whether they will be removed is something that a lot of Green campaigners are worried about. But also, there's nothing in the energy statement about efficiency. And again, to give listeners context, the government had promised in 2019 £9.2 billion worth of spending on energy efficiency work within the country, because we have a rotten set of housing stock that wastes an awful lot of energy. And so far, the government, out of that £9.2 billion, has pledged £4 billion of it, not actioned it, but has announced £4 billion of it. So again, they seem to be woefully behind things, Alison. They don't seem to be pushing things. And I do think, and you know what I talk about, Insulate Britain, because obviously they got into the headlines for blocking motorways. But actually the point of if you get people using less, that is a lot quicker and better way of actually helping with the energy crisis.
Yeah, from my understanding, it seems that the government has totally bottled it on onshore wind because of pressure coming from backbench Conservative MPs, and totally failed to realise that if you can get people to reduce the amount of energy they're using, that goes some way to fixing our energy security. And as you say, John, there is a huge need to make sure that homes are energy efficient. 13.4 million homes have a poor energy rating currently in the country. So for me, it's a real missed opportunity here. And what's interesting now for me is that, for the last few years, this debate about where our energy comes from has been driven by the climate crisis, but now it's being reframed because of our security crisis and the war in Ukraine. And that is shifting that whole dynamic about where we want to get our energy from, and options that historically we might not have been, some people might not have been as keen on, like nuclear. I think a lot of people are going to have to start looking at in much more consideration.
David?
Yeah, look, well, I think we touched on, first of all, obviously the commitment to nuclear power that the government has announced. And we were talking before we came on about, obviously, there are members of the party that would have concern about the rate of building new nuclear power stations. I will be upfront in saying that I personally am pro nuclear power. I think there is obviously a gap between what we can actually supply from renewables at this moment in time. Obviously, the view would be, like everyone does, that we would eventually get to a point where we would have 100% renewable energy, but that's probably not going to happen for a period of time. I think it's interesting to note that obviously there are concerns about nuclear power. I know obviously, John, you talked about coming from the area you do, with obviously dealing with the nasty after effects of nuclear power. My uncle actually used to work for British Nuclear at Sellafield, and obviously I quite know about obviously the nasty after effects and the years that it takes to deal with that. However, I think nuclear power in terms of its design, especially with some of the interesting aspects of the power plants that Bill Gates has been working on in terms of what's actually the after output from that, has dramatically reduced from the power plants that we have currently. So there may be further investigation into that. However, what I would say is there's just taking a slight tilt to the Scotland aspect, if you'll bear with me. Hunterston Power Station, which is the nuclear power station closest to my hometown, who's run by E.ON, had actually offered and said they could run that power plant for a further 10 years with some small investment, which was knocked back by the Scottish Government. They've now obviously gone through the process of shutting that down, and it means we now have a gap in terms of the energy that we can actually supply versus what Scotland's getting, despite the fact the Scottish Greens will tell you we are 100% renewable energy. That's absolutely false. I mean, we take from the national grid. It's not 100% renewable. If you remember, there was an announcement by the government, I think it was back in 2018 with Horizon Nuclear, which was Hitachi owned, about building some new nuclear power stations.
Hinkley C, that was,
yes, Hinkley C, yeah. That was obviously scrapped because the government were only willing to take a 1/3 investment in that project, which obviously means now we are majorly behind where we would have been if those projects had have been kicked off. So personally, I think I need to wait and see what this is going to look like, but certainly there's concerns there. And personally, from a fracking perspective, I am massively anti-fracking. I think anybody that's seen the Gasland documentary, it would give them serious concerns about the after effects of fracking. Not only, as you said, John, from the tremors that it can produce, but also from things like going into water supplies. And considering we're already dumping sewage into water, there's, dumping gas in probably doesn't bother the Conservatives, but that's another matter.
Maybe the sewage adds with the methane and just makes even more profitable maybe for fracking. But I mean, we will actually have a proper debate about nuclear, because it is something, I think broadly, the Lib Dem official position is that it needs to be part of the mix. I think that was in our last manifesto. Like I said, as Dave alluded to, I'm originally from West Cumbria and live very close to Sellafield, where I was brought up. And so even though people in West Cumbria will probably say, absolutely, go full nuclear because it gives us a job. 30,000 odd jobs in West Cumbria that has very few other jobs are reliant on the nuclear industry. From my point of view, all the evil gunk and stuff that you have to treat at the end of thing goes to one of the poorest communities in Britain for them to deal with. And I think until that is actually resolved, I find it very troublesome. But I understand zero carbon, but also there's a gap there as well. These nuclear power stations are not quick and easy to build.
No.
And so what do you do in the current decade before they come online? We're still going to have that same problem. So, natural gas was, and what Germany and all these other countries, natural gas was their kind of intermediate, their way of stepping up towards renewable sources, etc. So if that isn't the case, then you've got to think, okay, you've got to hit efficiency, you've got to hit renewables to bridge that gap in the meantime. And that's my worry, is the government's not doing that. And I think there'll be a lot of calls from within the Tory right to say, okay, let's use fracking as a stopgap. And I think that will be horrendous. But if you look at public opinion, fracking is by far the most unpopular, closely followed by nuclear. And actually things like onshore wind, which they say, the people don't like them, they're ugly, they're terrible. I've lived near on land wind farms, and actually I have no problem with them, and actually 80% of the public don't either, according to these opinion polls. So there's a disconnect there, but I'm not sure how they're going to fix it, Alison, without pleasing or displeasing everyone.
I think there could be a very interesting conversation within the Conservative Party between the net zero skeptics who are saying, yeah, we should start fracking. And then your kind of small c Conservative MPs who are like, I do not want fracking in my constituency and my residents will be up in arms about it.
I mean, you think about, and sorry, I'm just going to say, I think about in Lancashire as well, places like Blackpool, Fylde, all these are Tory seats. They're all Tory seats.
Yeah. I mean, Mid Sussex has a potential fracking site within it. I don't know if you remember Caroline Lucas getting arrested a few years back. So that's at Balcombe, which is in the constituency. So it's a hot issue here and something we've always been very strongly opposed to and will remain to be so, I think, as well.
Yeah. So that then leads up to other things, because this government, when we try and figure out these episodes, listeners, we think, okay, what has the government done this week? What are the topics? And we quickly think, we write down
too many things to write down.
Yeah, there's too many things. And so we can get onto something that obviously has really hit a lot of people, but I don't know how many people outside of, say, our wheelhouse thing, and it's about Channel 4 News. Not Channel 4, just Channel 4, beg your pardon. And actually, again, it's a fight this government seems to have picked for no reason. Or the reason we might think is that because Channel 4 News gives them quite a hard time and has some brilliant investigative journalism. And the fact so many Tory MPs, including Nadine Dorries, doesn't seem to know how Channel 4 is funded, that it's publicly owned, but the public doesn't invest in it. It's all done from advertising, etc. You just think, I mean, again, it baffles me, David, not just how these people are in government, let alone, I wouldn't trust them to run a lemonade store, let alone be in charge of a major government department.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, it's the Channel 4 thing is deeply puzzling, because it seems like they announced, if you remember earlier this year, they announced that they were considering a sell-off. Now, my opinion was they wouldn't announce that if they were seriously just going to go through with it, because why would you take the flak then by saying we're thinking about it if you weren't going to do it? So I couldn't understand the whole reasoning behind just saying we're thinking about it before they actually announced we're going to sell it off. So again, that's another thing we're talking about, sort of lunging from crisis to crisis of like, if you're going to do it, just do it. Why have this sort of medium position? What's quite interesting, and for anybody who doesn't know, my day job involves working in the media sector, and having spoken to people who I can't name, but people who work within the media industry, they find this deeply puzzling. They cannot understand why the government's doing this. They see Channel 4 as what one person quoted to me, a jewel in the crown of the British media industry, and supports a huge amount of creative industry within the UK. There's people who are questioning why the Conservatives, who, under Margaret Thatcher, tended to give a lot of priority towards creative industries, towards the arts, towards, to be frank, things that were considered for the higher echelons of society, the opera, the ballet, things like this, theatre, which nowadays I don't think you would necessarily think that way, but it used to be. And they seem to see the Conservatives as sort of rolling back on that, and especially with this attack on Channel 4. Now, what's interesting is some people have said to me, it just seems like it is purely down to the fact that Channel 4 News gives them a hard time as a government, and now they're looking to punish Channel 4 as a result. Now, there's several suitors who would be interested in taking over Channel 4, some very big media companies. I'm sure if anybody reads the Guardian article, they can see who they are. What will probably dictate for them, if they look to take it on, is what's the caveats that come with purchase? Will they still be expected to support the UK media sector, support, obviously, programming that wouldn't get to air if it wasn't for Channel 4's specific business purpose? So it will be interesting to see how it plays out. But again, you are absolutely right. I cannot imagine how Nadine Dorries can be in the position she's in if she doesn't understand that Channel 4 is not funded by the taxpayer.
And one of the key things, Alison, that people like Christian Guru Murphy has been said is actually independence of editorial decisions for Channel 4 News is one thing that absolutely, whatever happens, must be protected. But do you think they'll row back on this? Because actually, that's been quite a bit of pushback from Tory MPs and people like Ruth Davidson, etc.
Yeah, I heard Ruth Davidson speak out against it. I mean, for me, I don't like to come to this conclusion, but it feels as though it's just the culture wars, isn't it? It's what can we pick this week that will fire up our base and create a massive row on Twitter, and we can accuse people of, being snowflakes. And this week it's Channel 4. If you look at what Tories said when she announced on Twitter, because obviously that's the best place to announce government policy, when she announced on Twitter that she's going to do this, she said it's
Donald Trump playbook.
Yeah, I mean, but rubbish, not even as good as Donald Trump, and not as entertaining. Yeah, she said she thinks it's the best thing to enable Channel 4 to compete with Netflix and Amazon, but Channel 4 isn't there to compete with Netflix and Amazon. And actually what it does is qualitatively different to Netflix and Amazon. You know, it has a really, really good news service. Netflix and Amazon aren't in that space, are they?
Plus, Netflix are in massive amount of debt. That's the other thing.
And the other thing she said is that it will bring up, enable the money will encourage sort of new creative startups. But actually, Channel 4 already does that and already brings through new talent and new kinds of programming. So I can only conclude that, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it's the culture wars, and I kind of refuse to engage with this stuff on social media for that reason, because it's playing their game, and that's not what we need to do.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there, John. In terms of like Netflix are bundled with a huge amount of debt. They use what they call it's a totally legitimate, by the way, practice of finance of accounting called amortization, which means you spread the cost of your outgoings across several years, and they obviously use their subscriber numbers to dictate, by X, 5 years time, we'll be able to cover that debt because our subscriber numbers will go up. But what it does mean is that Netflix has to have a constant influx of new subscribers to keep up with that debt. And there's only so long you can do that. Channel 4 doesn't have to do that. And it's, as you rightly said, Alison, it's specifically designed not to do that. It's a linear broadcast channel, which gives airtime to programming that typically might not get airtime within the UK from, a purely commercial broadcaster. I mean, I think the main one to highlight is, would programming like It's a Sin have got onto UK television if it hadn't have been for Channel 4? Would the Paralympics get the amount of coverage it gets on Channel 4 if it wasn't for Channel 4 and, helping push disability sport? So this is going to deeply affect not only the creative sector, but it's also going to deeply affect how, as you rightly say, Alison, how we change culture in this country, because these open up people's eyes to the difficulties of, for instance, with the Paralympics, how difficult it is to be a disabled person trying to compete in sport in the UK. Similarly, with programs like It's a Sin, it sheds a light on the difficulty for the LGBT community at that time, especially with the AIDS epidemic. And I think that's great. And we're now in a position where that's going to be deeply, deeply affected.
And again, it's a fight they don't need to take. And again, it's also quite ignorant of fact, and some people may not know this, but the massive amount of money the creative industry brings into Britain, I think, is often overlooked, just how much, and also across regions of Britain as well. So obviously in the Northwest, you have Salford, you have outposts in Bristol and Birmingham and Scotland and everywhere. There's lots and lots of places that benefit greatly from the creative industries. And this government seems like, oh, well, they have a different opinion, let's just scrap it. But the good, like I say, it's one crisis to another. And Alison brought up culture wars, and one of the most depressing parts of the so-called culture wars now is definitely about trans rights. And again, this has come up this last week, and we are, just so listeners and viewers are aware, we have an episode planned after the local elections where we'll have people from the trans community, a real in-depth episode about this issue, because we understand it is one that gets a lot of misrepresentation. Some people have various ideas that I think are maybe not quite where they should be, or don't hear the opposing views. So we will be having a big debate about that. But in a week when we have our first kind of trans MP coming out within the Conservative Party, they somehow again managed to completely, balls up the narrative of it in terms of, and this is about conversion therapy, how they're suddenly going to, because the plan was, and I think Alison and Dave will correct me if I'm wrong, that all conversion theory would be banned. And now they've said, actually, it will be banned except in cases of trans individuals, which again is just, why would you pick that particular fight? It just seems absolutely ludicrous. And actually now 100 organisations pulled out of their, I've got to make sure it's safe to be me, kind of conference, that this was an LGBT conference the government was going to do, so much so that they've now had to cancel the entire conference. And I can understand again, whipping up your own base. Let's get someone angry about. Let's put Keir Starmer in a really awkward position about it. But actually, when it comes to the polling on the next general election, where do we think trans rights is going to be in terms of the top 10, top 20 issues that people are going to be voting on? Probably not there. But what you are doing is hurting people who is a massive personal issue for them. And again, this government is just rotten. It is just rotten. And Alison, I'm going to let you carry on because I'm going to go into a Hannah Kitchen sort of rant if I go on any further.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly sad and makes me really angry that this is being made into such a toxic issue. In your summary of what happened, John, I have to tell you that you missed out a whole U-turn from the government. Yeah. So they'd committed to ban conversion therapy. Then they U-turned and said they wouldn't ban conversion therapy. Then there was an outcry and there was another U-turn. And that's when they decided they'd just ban conversion therapy for gay people. But they would maintain conversion therapy for trans people. And I mean, the key quote on just how shallow and manipulative the Prime Minister is about this was after the second U-turn, when it...
Oh, no. I might have lost her.
Yeah, I think we've lost Alison.
We've lost Alison. So, David, see, she did so many U-turns, the government, it short-circuited her computer. So, but David, do you want to continue on with this?
Yeah, look, it's deeply troubling, and it's just a continuation of hammering a community that is already as hammered as they possibly could be. I mean, I'm quite proud of the Liberal Democrats in terms of our role in the coalition government and taking a stance on gay marriage and saying this is the right thing to do. It's morally correct to do it. Where's the morals here in saying that the trans community are somehow a second tier of society that should be absolutely open to conversion therapy when other people are banned from being subjected to it? Again, I would just, for anybody who... And I've knocked on doors, and you are right, John. I think it's not going to be the key issue that makes people vote, but they are firing up people around it. And I've had rants on the doorstep about, just misinformation about, they're trying to turn kids trans in schools and so on and so forth. And you're just thinking that's coming from somewhere, and it comes from top level leadership and government down. And I think it's morally offensive from Boris Johnson. But again, look, the Prime Minister has said so many things that are offensive that this just is another thing. And I don't think he cares.
And it is interesting that I opened my mailbox when I got in from canvassing last night, and there's no personal details on this, so nothing. So this is one of our reply forms to our latest leaflet. And there was nothing regarding any of these issues on it. And he's come back, and this gentleman says, first he starts off with there's too many mosques. That would be that's the first one, and you wouldn't get churches being built in Pakistan and India. Well, you kind of do, and then ended it with saying, "And don't get me started on the issues of gender. A man has a penis and a woman doesn't," and that's kind of and that's the kind of personality that the Tories are trying to fire up. Like you said, Donald Trump did it. It was a classic thing: pick a thing and get the base fired up. But ultimately, I don't get the political point of it, because I think you win by appealing to the moderates in Britain. Blair did it successfully. Cameron nearly got 2 terms, successful majorities, based on kind of, again, just moderating your view in terms of and appealing to the sensible middle Britain, which 99% of people actually stay within. We've all got the people in our wards that we know, we think, oh, crikey, it's Mr. Such and Such, he's going to go on about whatever. But actually, I think most people are good folk who just think, all right, let you live your life, love who you want to be, and love who you want to love. And other than that, most people don't care.
And I would stress again, John, I think the majority of people understand how difficult and how awful it must be for the identity of a person who, comes out as a trans individual, and how difficult a process that is, and how difficult it must be to obviously let your loved ones and friends, etc., be acknowledge that. It's already a very, very difficult situation And this is just making it 10 times worse.
Yeah.
And I cannot understand why you would pick on those people. Yeah. It just seems like it's an easy target, and you think it's going to win you some votes, and you don't care who it hurts, so you'll just do it.
And also, I mean, Alison's now back. Welcome back, Alison. But on a very serious point about the targeting those individuals, let's not remember rates of suicide, self-harm, and other things in these kind of targeted communities is not where it needs to be. It's actually very bad. And actually, is this making it worse by making it into such a toxic issue? And the whole thing gets me, like I say, very angry and very defensive on it. But Alison, I think you were talking about various U-turns, so much so your computer went on the fritz. So
my computer couldn't handle any more U-turns.
Yeah, we'll let you continue your point.
Yeah, what I was about to say was, for me, and it echoes what you were just saying. One of my very best friends has got 2 children. They're both under 10. And the older one is a little girl, and the younger one, from the age of about 2.5, is a girl. She's still a she, but she identified as non-binary. And for me, it's as simple as this. When I look at my friend's 2 children, I want both of them to have the happiest, best lives they can have. And I want our society to make that as easy as possible, given that one of those children is likely to face all sorts of extra challenges, mental health challenges, access to employment, all sorts of things that her sister, will not face. And it's as simple as that. That's, I want the best for both of those children.
And like I said, listeners, we will be doing a specific issue on this, because I do realise it is, and it's something that I also want people from the trans community to be on this podcast. So it's not just 3 people who aren't gay or trans or anything else, who aren't in the LGBT plus community. But we will have a specific episode on that. But it just kind of leads it. Maybe this is where the fight is going to be, David. This is maybe there's going to be a fight of incompetence on one side, culture wars on the other, and we'll see which one wins over the next couple of years.
Yeah, but I think that's just an important point to make there, John. And I think it's absolutely right that we give this platform over to people from that community that can speak to the issues that affect them. But I think it's also important for people in our party to know that, for the 3 of us, obviously, John, you and I, straight white males, we have to stand up and defend these people where possible, because we have the ability to take flack that is much, much less than what those people endure and have to put up with. And it's right that we also use our platform to defend and stick up for those people. So I think that's absolutely right. But I'm looking forward to having individuals from that community on here to talk about the issues that affect them.
Yeah. Well, and on that, actually, David, you requested actually to do an extra issue. There's shenanigans going up in Scotland, and you were determined to bring it on this podcast. So you let us know what is actually happening. I can't remember what the issue was called now, David. I've lost my notes.
Well, we've talked about government incompetence, and I'm about to give you a crash course in probably the most incompetent scandal that is enveloping the Scottish government that could potentially lead to Nicola Sturgeon's demise, and you will not believe the things that have been happening in this. So for any of our listeners who obviously don't live north of the border, as they might be aware, obviously I am originally from Scotland, and I'm originally from a place called Inverclyde, and on Inverclyde we have the last commercial shipbuilder on the Clyde called Ferguson's Marine. Ferguson's Marine in 2014 went into administration, and there was obviously concerns for the Scottish government at the time that they were going into an independence referendum, and it didn't look very good to have the last commercial shipbuilder on the Clyde go under. And they got, shall we say, a good friend of the Scottish government at the time, a gentleman called Jim McCall, who's quite a prominent Scottish businessman, to invest in the yard with the promise of funding towards upgrading the yard and facilities to be allowed them to compete for larger contracts that would hopefully keep the yard in operation for years to come. Now, first of all, I'll caveat this, because what the SNP supporters attack us on is they go, oh, so did you want us just to let the yard go into administration and people lose their jobs? No, absolutely not. You want to ensure that people continue to keep their jobs, but the after effects of what happened are not only scandalous, but has been, and I'll, for legal purposes, I will say, within the Scottish Parliament, it has been intimated that there's questions maybe even about corruption here, about how those contracts that were put together for Ferguson's Marines have been initiated. So Ferguson's Marine won a contract from the Scottish Government to produce 2 ferries for Calmac, which is also a Scottish-owned business, which provides ferry services throughout the whole of Scotland, mostly to the island communities within Scotland. 2 of these were won in a bid of about 96 million was the contract for Ferguson's Marine, one of which is the MV Glen Sannox, which was supposed to be in operation in 2018. It is still laid up as of today. So it's massively over schedule. It's also now going to cost the taxpayer another 250 million to complete the vessels. It was launched by Nicola Sturgeon in 2019, but here's the key thing. It was launched despite the fact it shouldn't have been, because first of all, for anybody who knows anything about shipbuilding, the bulbous bow was actually not properly fitted and was deemed by the authorities to not be safe. And it's very much harder to fix that once the vessel is in the water and costs a lot more money to do. Secondly, when she launched the vessel, the windows were painted on. They weren't even completed. And also the funnels were basically fakes. They weren't operational funnels. They were just added on. Now, the view that is concerning a lot of people is this contract was announced at the SNP conference as a look at this great contract we are giving to Ferguson's Marine that's going to give people new jobs. It's going to invest in the yard. It's investment in Scotland. And actually, a lot of the safeguards that are usually put in place for these contracts were not in place. And also, the Fergusons had agreed basically percentages that they had to meet to get further down payments on this contract. But what they were actually doing is they were moving quite fast ahead with things just to get the payments when things weren't actually properly completed. And the government was paying them out because they hadn't put any safeguards in the contract to stop having to do that. They've obviously then subsequently taken the yard into Scottish Government hands. They hired a gentleman to turn around the business, a gentleman called Tim Hare, who they were paying £2,700 a day to run it. And the famous quote from the Scottish Parliament was, "Who did they think they were getting? Lionel Messi," as opposed to Tim Hare. They are now also saying that one of the hulls that is still sitting there, which, by the way, when I drive home, the hull is there in full view, which hasn't been named. It's still hull, I think it's 803 or something. That's likely not going to be anywhere near completion for a further 5 years. The vessel that did get launched, all its systems that were actually installed are probably now out of support because they've been sat installed and not been used. So that's a huge cost that's going to be incurred as well. And there's also now questions really about the future of the yard, because they've got 2 ferries that is likely they will probably have to just scrap and they can't finish. It's going to cost the taxpayer a further 250 million. Other contracts for Calmac have now been given to Turkish shipyards when the Scottish Government owns a shipyard. And I also think that's ridiculous because the Scottish Government's very quick to attack the wider UK government on working with governments that have, serious human rights abuses, but they're happy to give contracts to Turkey, which obviously has concerns around how they're treating some of the ethnic communities there. It's a huge scandal. It's now really starting to hit home with how badly it's been managed. Nicola Sturgeon's trying to push the blame onto the now disgraced Derek Mackay, who was an MSP that was found to be sending messages to young boys, who's now out of government. And Derek Mackay says he's going to go in front of any inquiry and tell them the truth, which is that although he was the Transport Secretary at the time, contracts of that size have to go up to very senior party figures to be signed off. So this is going to come back to the First Minister's door. And she is still yet to apologise for the island communities that have been waiting for a new ferry for now nearly 7 years. So... if you were to think, a very Scottish scandal, is that almost the name of what we'll call that piece? But the issue that we have is that whatever happens with Nicola Sturgeon, she's very Boris Johnson-esque in terms of things don't stick to her, and will this actually stick to her?
the aggro, because what she's very good at playing off is like, yes, this hasn't gone well, but look how bad they're doing at Westminster. And that just seems to be the SNP's line. And you, David, sent us their latest party political broadcast, which was basically just doing that. It says, yeah, just look how bad it is down there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, I mean, she was interviewed, I think, by LBC, who asked her to apologise to the island communities. And instead of saying an apology, she said, I regret what's gone on, rather than say, I'm sorry. So she's been very choice in her words. You are right. There are a lot of things that seem to struggle to stick to her. But I think this is something she's struggling to get away from or get ahead from. But I think there are people that, as seems to happen in the SNP, are prepared to throw themselves under the bus to save Nicola. So, Keith Brown, who is the SNP deputy leader, was involved in this contract at the time because he was the government minister responsible while Stuart McMillan, not Stuart McMillan, the responsible transport secretary was away. So, yeah, there's going to be questions asked, and somebody has to bear responsibility for this. And I think she's going to struggle to get away from a full public inquiry, because 250 million of taxpayers' money is not minimal money when we have a cost of living crisis. I think people are going to seriously ask what's going on.
So we've had a Scottish update. Anything from down south? There any new changes, Alison? Any mid-Sussex scandals going on?
None that I can share yet. The thing that made it onto Guido Fawkes this week was the absolute scandal of a Green activist taking a Conservative leaflet out of a letterbox and being captured on a Ring doorbell. Yeah. And the MP for Arundel and South Downs, Andrew Griffith, who is now, he's got some fairly important things to think about, including being sort of policy or strategy director for Number 10, I think. He described it as deeply sinister in a democracy. There are ways to describe it, but deeply sinister isn't one of them. So yes, a warning to all Lib Dem campaigners out there busy putting leaflets through local elections. First of all, always make sure the leaflet goes all the way through the letterbox and don't leave it in the draft traps. Yeah. And secondly, beware Ring doorbells. But of course, no Liberal Democrat would ever take a leaflet out of a door. I know this.
Absolutely. And even if said those Lib Dems might be tempted to do it now, it's just not worthwhile, because there are so many smart doorbells now. You'll just get, eventually, just have some spies in your local ward that will tell you whenever you get an opposition leaflet to scan it in or take a photograph and send you it. It's just not worth doing that anymore. But that was a big episode. That was we covered a lot. And my worry is, by next week, we might have another 10 different topics to go on about. We haven't even talked about Elon Musk taking over Twitter or anything else that's coming up. So there's all sorts. And very important, we haven't talked about Ukraine at all. So, and actually the atrocities that have happened in Ukraine and what happens with that. Will that mean an escalation? Again, there'll be lots of episodes coming up, because now that Alison is free from her selection duties, David doesn't have elections this year. You know what? They're basically easy. They might be running this podcast by next week. So we will see how we're doing. But thank you.
I'm going to take over the Lib Dem pod like Elon Musk taking over.
Yes, Twitter. He's going to buy a stake. No, because you'll add an edit button every time I go to do an introduction. There'll be a change. But thanks so much, Alison and Dave, for coming on today. Thank you everyone for listening, for watching, for following us on social media and interacting. Big thank you to our Patreon subscribers who throw us a little bit of money every month. We really appreciate it. If anyone wants to do that, you can do. Go to patreon.com/Lib Dem Pod. We appreciate every single penny that you donate to us. And just look after yourselves. Do get out there campaigning. There's postal votes land on around the 19th of this month, so make sure you're hitting those postal voters. Make sure you're knocking on as many doors as possible, and make sure you're enjoying yourself as well while you're doing it. So thank you very much for listening and watching. We'll be back with another episode very soon.